The night they saved a seat for everyone except me was the night everything began to change. I remember standing in the doorway of Eleanor Harper's dining room, holding a bowl of homemade macaroni and cheese, while 20 pairs of eyes briefly turned in my direction and then looked away again. It was Eleanor's 76th birthday, and the house was filled with family. Laughter drifted through the rooms. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. On the surface, it looked like the kind of gathering people dream about. A close family celebrating together. But appearances can be misleading. My name is Grace Harper. I was 35 years old that evening, and although I had carried the Harper last name for most of my life, there were still people in that house who treated me like a guest. Or worse, an obligation. I carefully carried the dish into the dining room and immediately noticed something strange. Every chair around the large oak table was occupied. Victoria sat beside her mother. Her husband Mark sat across from her. Cousins, grandchildren, and family friends filled the remaining seats. The only empty setting sat at a small folding table positioned against the far wall. A table meant for children during holiday gatherings. For a moment, I thought there had been a mistake. Then I saw Victoria smiling as she adjusted her napkin. "There you are," she said brightly. "We put a seat aside for you." She pointed toward the folding table. Several people avoided eye contact. Nobody said a word. I smiled politely. Years of experience had taught me how to do that. "Thank you," I replied. I carried my dish to the buffet counter and took my seat at the small table. From there, I could see everyone but felt miles away from them. The conversation continued without interruption. Nobody objected. Nobody offered to switch places. Even after all these years, moments like that still stung. Not because I wanted attention, because they reminded me that some people never stopped seeing me as different. Eleanor sat quietly at the head of the table. Her silver hair reflected the warm chandelier light above her. Our eyes met briefly. I noticed something. In her expression, not anger, not sadness, awareness. She had seen exactly what happened. Yet she said nothing. At least not then. Dinner continued. Victoria talked about her latest vacation. Mark discussed a new investment opportunity. Other relatives shared stories and laughed together. Every so often someone included me in a conversation, but it always felt polite rather than genuine. Like they were checking a box. I had experienced it my entire life. 30 years earlier, Eleanor and her late husband had welcomed me into their home as a foster child. I was 5 years old when I arrived, carrying a small suitcase and more uncertainty than any child should have to carry. Eleanor had loved me from the beginning. Not everyone else had. Some relatives treated me kindly. Others tolerated me. A few never accepted me at all. Victoria belonged to that last group. She was 13 years older than me and had spent decades reminding me, directly and indirectly, that I was not truly one of them. As dessert was served, I watched her place a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Mom," she said with a smile, "you know we are all here because family is what matters most." Several people nodded. The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, I took a sip of iced tea and remained silent. Across the room, Eleanor continued watching. There was something unusual in her gaze that evening. Something thoughtful, almost determined. After the cake was cut and presents began appearing on the table, I prepared myself for another predictable family gathering. Another evening where I would quietly help clean up before driving home alone. I had no idea that Eleanor had been paying attention to far more than anyone realized. And I certainly had no idea that before this story was over, the seat they saved for me would become the least important thing anyone remembered about that night. People often assume that being accepted into a family happens all at once. They imagine a single moment when everyone opens their hearts and decides you belong. My experience was very different. Belonging was always something that seemed just out of reach. After Eleanor's birthday dinner continued that evening, I found myself thinking about the day I first entered the Harper family. I was 5 years old. I remember sitting in the back seat of a social worker's car, clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. Everything I owned fit inside a worn suitcase. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I was leaving somewhere behind. When we pulled into the driveway, Eleanor was waiting on the front porch. I still remember her smile. Warm, gentle, certain. She knelt down beside me and said, "You must be Grace. We have been waiting for you." No one had ever said those words to me before. "We have been waiting for you." For years afterward, I held on to them. Eleanor and her husband welcomed me into their home without hesitation. They painted my bedroom pale yellow because someone had told them it was a cheerful color. They filled a bookshelf with children's books. They hung a small framed photo of all of us together only weeks after I arrived. They made room for me. At least they tried. Not everyone felt the same way. Victoria was 18 at the time, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to form opinions. From the beginning, she treated me politely in front of Eleanor. But even as a child, I noticed the difference. There were little things. Family photos where she stood slightly apart from me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Introductions where she referred to me as the foster girl instead of her sister. None of it seemed important by itself. Together, it created a message that followed me for decades. You are here, but you are not really one of us. As I grew older, the message became more direct. When relatives gathered for holidays, people would ask Victoria about college, careers, and future plans. They asked me where I came from. When family heirlooms were discussed, everyone assumed they would eventually pass to Victoria. Nobody imagined I might have a place in that conversation. By the time I reached high school, I had learned something important. Arguing never changed anyone's mind. Working hard sometimes did. So I focused on school. I got a part-time job. I helped around the house. I stayed out of trouble. Eleanor noticed every effort. She attended every school event she could. She celebrated every achievement. But even her support could not erase the feeling that I was constantly being evaluated, constantly compared, constantly reminded that blood relationships mattered more to some people than everything else. Back in the dining room, I watched Victoria laugh with several relatives as they discussed old family stories. None of those stories included me. That was normal. Yet something about that evening felt different. Perhaps it was the way Eleanor kept observing the room. Perhaps it was the thoughtful look she carried throughout the night. Or perhaps it was because, for the first time, I was beginning to realize how much she had seen over the years. While others noticed where I came from, Eleanor noticed where I showed up. While others measured family by history, Eleanor measured it by presence. I did not fully understand that yet. But before long, everyone in that house would. The older I became, the more I understood that loyalty is usually invisible. Grand gestures get attention. Quiet consistency rarely does. After Eleanor's birthday dinner moved into the living room, people gathered around coffee tables balancing slices of cake and paper cups of coffee. Conversations drifted from grandchildren to vacations to retirement plans. I helped carry empty plates to the kitchen, just as I always did. Nobody asked me to. Nobody thanked me either. It was simply one of those things I had done for years. As I rinsed dishes at the sink, memories surfaced one after another. Most people in that house saw a foster daughter who had been fortunate enough to receive a place in the Harper family. What they never saw were the thousands of ordinary moments that happened when nobody else was around. About 8 years earlier, Eleanor slipped on ice outside her mailbox during a January snowstorm. She was not seriously injured, but her doctor told her she should not drive for several weeks. Victoria lived less than 30 minutes away. Yet during those weeks, it was me who drove Eleanor to every appointment. Every Tuesday morning, every follow-up visit, every pharmacy stop. I never mentioned it to anyone because it never occurred to me that I should. When Eleanor needed groceries, I brought groceries. When her water heater failed one summer, I spent an entire weekend helping coordinate repairs. When she struggled to carry heavy boxes from the garage to the basement, I showed up after work and helped. None of those things felt extraordinary. They felt normal, at least to me. Meanwhile, family gatherings often followed the same pattern. Victoria arrived with stories. Mark arrived with opinions. I arrived with practical help. Somehow, stories and opinions always received more attention. I remember one Thanksgiving when Eleanor caught the flu 2 days before the holiday. Most relatives suggested postponing dinner. I spent 2 evenings preparing food in her kitchen while she rested upstairs. On Thanksgiving morning, everyone praised how smoothly the day came together. Nobody asked how. Eleanor noticed, though. She always noticed. Back in the living room, I watched her sitting quietly in her favorite armchair. People moved around her carrying desserts and coffee cups. Yet she seemed distant, thoughtful, almost as if she were reviewing years of memories that nobody else could see. At one point, Victoria sat beside her and began discussing future plans for the family property. I was too far away to hear every word, but I noticed Eleanor's expression change slightly. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to reflection. Grace, Could you help me for a moment? Eleanor called. I immediately crossed the room. Of course. She smiled warmly. Would you bring me that photo album from the study? Absolutely. The study sat at the end of the hallway. I had been in that room hundreds of times over the years. As I entered, I noticed the familiar shelves lined with books, framed photographs, and family keepsakes. I found the album resting on a desk and reached for it. That was when I noticed a small stack of notebooks beside it. Old journals. Eleanor had always kept journals. I had never read them. Never wanted to. Some things deserve privacy. Still, seeing them there reminded me how much of a person's life remains hidden from everyone else. We think we know people because we attend birthdays and holidays. But the truth often lives in quiet moments nobody witnesses. I carried the album back into the living room and handed it to Eleanor. She thanked me softly. As our eyes met, I sensed something unusual. It felt almost like gratitude. Not for the photo album, for something much larger. At the time, I could not explain it. I only knew that while everyone else seemed focused on celebrating the past, Eleanor appeared to be preparing for something that had not happened yet. And before the night was over, I would discover just how carefully she had been paying attention all these years. As the evening continued, the house grew quieter. Some relatives moved into smaller conversations, while others flipped through the old photo album Eleanor had asked me to bring from the study. Laughter still appeared now and then, but something had changed. At least for me. I could not shake the feeling that Eleanor was watching everything with unusual attention. Not in a worried way. In a deliberate way. Almost as if she were gathering pieces of a puzzle only she could see. I sat near the edge of the living room with a cup of coffee while several relatives crowded around the photo album. Every few pages, someone would point at an old picture and share a memory. Victoria seemed especially eager to tell stories. Most of them revolved around family traditions that existed before I arrived. Listening to them felt familiar. Not painful exactly, just familiar. For many years, I had learned how to sit beside conversations that never quite included me. Remember this trip? Mark asked while pointing to a photograph. Victoria laughed. Of course. That was before everything became complicated. Several people smiled. Nobody explained what complicated meant. Nobody needed to. Family history often has invisible boundaries. I had spent most of my life standing just outside some of them. Across the room, Eleanor quietly listened. She did not interrupt. She rarely interrupted. One of the things I admired most about her was her ability to observe before speaking. Years earlier, when I was in college and struggling financially, I never asked anyone for help. I worked evenings at a grocery store while attending classes during the day. Most relatives never knew. Eleanor did. One afternoon, she appeared at my apartment carrying homemade soup and a bag of groceries. She never mentioned the sacrifices I was making. She simply noticed them. That was who she was. The more I thought about it, the more examples came to mind. When she underwent cataract surgery, I rearranged my work schedule to drive her to appointments. When she needed help sorting through paperwork after her husband passed away, I spent weekends organizing documents and records. When storms damaged part of her fence, I helped coordinate repairs. None of those moments became family stories. Nobody gathered around holiday tables discussing them. They happened quietly, like most meaningful things. Grace, Eleanor suddenly said from across the room, would you bring me the blue folder from the study? Of course, I replied. Victoria glanced toward me, but said nothing. I returned to the study and immediately spotted the folder resting beside the journals I had noticed earlier. As I picked it up, several loose papers shifted slightly. One page slid partway out. I caught it before it fell. Without meaning to, I noticed a handwritten note clipped to the top. My name appeared on it. Just my name. Grace. Nothing else. I froze for a moment. Curiosity tugged at me, but I quickly placed the paper back where it belonged. If Eleanor wanted me to see it, she would show me herself. I carried the folder back into the living room and handed it to her. Thank you, dear, she said warmly. Dear. The words sounded simple, yet it carried more affection than some people manage to express in entire conversations. Eleanor placed the folder beside her chair, but did not open it. Instead, she rested her hand on top of it and continued listening as relatives discussed old memories. Then something happened that caught my attention. One of the younger cousins asked a simple question. Who spent the most time helping Grandma after Grandpa died? The room became strangely quiet. Victoria opened her mouth as if preparing to answer. Then she hesitated. Mark looked away. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody seemed eager to respond. Finally, Eleanor smiled softly. "That is an interesting question," she said. Her eyes briefly met mine. "Perhaps it is one we should talk about before the night is over." And for the first time all evening, I noticed genuine discomfort spreading across several faces in the room. The atmosphere in the room changed after Eleanor asked that question. It was subtle at first. Conversations became shorter. Laughter faded more quickly. People who had spent the evening confidently sharing opinions now seemed careful about what they said. I remained seated near the window, unsure why a simple question had created so much discomfort. The answer seemed obvious to me. Family members help each other. That was what families were supposed to do. Yet the silence suggested something else. Eleanor sat quietly for several moments before reaching for the blue folder resting beside her chair. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention. Victoria stopped talking. Mark lowered his coffee cup. Even the younger relatives looked curious. "There are some things I would like to share tonight," Eleanor said calmly. Her voice was gentle, but there was a certainty behind it that made everyone listen. She opened the folder and removed several papers. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Receipts, appointment schedules, handwritten notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing valuable. Yet Eleanor handled them with surprising care. "Over the years," she continued, "I started keeping records." Victoria smiled politely. "Records of what?" Eleanor looked directly at her. "Of kindness." The room became completely silent. I felt my cheeks grow warm. Surely she was not talking about me. Eleanor lifted the first document. "This is a transportation schedule from 7 years ago after my cataract surgery." She glanced at the paper. 23 medical appointments. Every single ride provided by Grace. Several relatives exchanged glances. Victoria shifted slightly in her seat. Eleanor set the paper down and picked up another. "This is a receipt from a pharmacy." Then another. And another. She smiled softly. "During a period when I struggled to drive, Grace collected my prescriptions almost every week." My stomach tightened. I had never considered any of those errands important enough to remember. Eleanor clearly had. "There is more," she said. She removed another stack of papers. Home repair invoices, grocery deliveries, insurance paperwork, tax preparation appointments, emergency plumbing calls. She paused. Most people only see major events. They rarely see the small acts that make daily life possible. Nobody interrupted. Nobody seemed capable of interrupting. The room felt frozen. Eleanor continued organizing papers into neat piles across the coffee table. Each document represented a memory I had long forgotten. A Saturday spent helping clean gutters. An afternoon spent waiting in a doctor's office. A week spent sorting financial paperwork after a storm damaged part of the property. To me, they were ordinary moments. To Eleanor, they had become evidence. "Why keep all of this?" Mark finally asked. Eleanor smiled. "Because gratitude deserves a memory." The answer settled over the room. I noticed Victoria staring at the documents with growing unease. For years, she had viewed me as someone who benefited from the Harper family, someone fortunate to be included. The papers on the table suggested a different story, not a story of obligation, a story of presence. Eleanor picked up a small notebook next. I also kept notes. She opened it carefully. Whenever someone helped me during a difficult time, I wrote it down. My heart skipped a beat. "Eleanor," I said quietly, "you do not have to do this." She looked at me with warmth. "Yes, I do." The room remained silent as she turned several pages. Then she began reading short entries aloud. Dates. Simple observations. Grace stayed until midnight helping sort documents. Grace brought groceries during the snowstorm. Grace canceled a weekend trip to drive me to a specialist appointment. Grace checked on me every evening after surgery. One entry after another. Year after year. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked their phones. By the time Eleanor closed the notebook, the room felt entirely different from the one that had existed earlier. That evening, the folding table in the corner no longer seemed important. The old assumptions no longer felt secure. And for the first time in my life, I began to realize that Eleanor had been quietly watching everything while everyone else was busy deciding who mattered and who did not. The silence that followed Eleanor's words felt heavier than any argument I had ever witnessed. Nobody knew what to say. The documents spread across the coffee table had done something years of family gatherings never managed to accomplish. They had forced people to confront reality. Not assumptions. Not family mythology. Reality. I sat quietly, wishing the attention would move somewhere else. Yet Eleanor was not finished. She closed the notebook and rested both hands on top of it. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. "There is something all of you should understand," she said. "These papers are not about favors." Several relatives nodded uncertainly. "Grace never kept score," Eleanor continued. "In fact, most of the things written here happened because she thought nobody was paying attention." I immediately looked down at the floor. That part was true. If I had known Eleanor was documenting every visit and every act of support, I probably would have asked her not to. "Then why keep records?" Victoria asked. Her voice was calm, but I could hear tension underneath it. Eleanor smiled gently. "Because people often remember what they are given. They forget who stayed when giving became difficult." Nobody answered. Victoria folded her arms. Mark stared at the stack of papers. Across the room, several cousins seemed uncomfortable. For years, family narratives had been built around bloodlines, traditions, and expectations. Eleanor was quietly dismantling those narratives one fact at a time. "I have listened to conversations for decades," Eleanor said. "Some spoken directly in front of me. Others spoken when people thought I was not paying attention." Her voice remained calm. "Again and again, I heard the same idea. That Grace should be grateful simply for being included." The room became still. My heart tightened. I had heard those words before too. Sometimes directly. Sometimes indirectly. Sometimes disguised as jokes. "The truth," Eleanor continued, "is that I am the one who is grateful." Several people looked surprised. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Mom, nobody is saying Grace has not helped." Eleanor turned toward her. "No, Victoria. People rarely say that at all." The honesty in her response caught everyone off guard. Even me. For years, Eleanor had avoided confrontation. She preferred patience over conflict. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight she was determined to speak plainly. "Do you know what I noticed after your father passed away?" Eleanor asked. Nobody answered. The phone calls became less frequent. The visits became shorter. Everyone was busy. Everyone had responsibilities. I understood that. Her eyes moved toward me. But Grace kept showing up. I felt a lump forming in my throat. Birthdays. Appointments. Holidays. Ordinary Tuesdays. Difficult Fridays. She showed up. The room remained silent. That is what family looks like to me. No one challenged her. No one could. Because every document on the table supported what she was saying. Every note. Every receipt. Every appointment record. Years of evidence sat in front of us. Victoria looked away. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain. "I never asked for recognition," I said quietly. Eleanor smiled. "I know. I only did what anyone should do." "No," she replied softly. "You did what very few people actually do." The words landed harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew she was not talking about errands or paperwork. She was talking about commitment. About choosing to remain present when nobody was watching. Eleanor reached for another folder resting beside her chair. Unlike the previous one, this folder appeared older. The edges were worn. The papers inside looked official. Immediately, I noticed a change in the room. Victoria sat straighter. Mark exchanged a glance with her. Several relatives suddenly became very interested. Whatever was inside that folder clearly mattered. Eleanor rested her hand on top of it and smiled gently. "There is one final thing I would like to discuss tonight," she said. Her voice remained warm, but something about it felt final, deliberate, important. And as I watched the expressions around the room shift from discomfort to anticipation, I realized that everything we had discussed so far had only been the beginning. Every eye in the room followed the old folder as Eleanor slowly opened it. The atmosphere felt completely different from the birthday celebration that had started only a few hours earlier. The cake sat untouched on the counter. Coffee cups had gone cold. Nobody seemed interested in small talk anymore. Whatever Eleanor was about to reveal had everyone's attention. I sat quietly, still uncomfortable with being the center of so much discussion. Across the room, Victoria appeared tense. Mark leaned forward in his chair. Several relatives exchanged curious glances. Eleanor removed a thick set of papers and carefully placed them on the coffee table. Unlike the receipts and notebooks, these documents looked formal. Official. The kind people immediately recognize as important. "Many of you know that I updated my estate plan last year," Eleanor said calmly. A few people nodded. Victoria's posture straightened slightly. For years, everyone had assumed certain things about the future. Some assumptions were never spoken aloud, but they existed all the same. The Harper home, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio Eleanor and her late husband had built over decades. Most people believed they knew where those things would eventually go. Eleanor looked around the room before continuing. I met with my attorney several times. Victoria smiled politely. That is good planning, Mom. Eleanor returned the smile. Yes, it is. Something about her tone made the room grow even quieter. She lifted a single document from the stack. Before anyone makes assumptions, I want to explain how I made my decisions. No one interrupted. For most of my life, I believed inheritance should follow tradition. She paused. Then I began asking myself a different question. Mark folded his hands together. What question? Eleanor looked directly at him. Who has actually been here? The words landed with remarkable force. Nobody moved. Nobody looked comfortable. Not who shares my blood. Eleanor continued gently. Not who carries the family name. Not who expects something. Who has been here? I lowered my eyes. My heart was beating faster now. The conversation was moving somewhere I did not want it to go. For years, I observed, Eleanor said. Not because I planned this discussion. Because I wanted to understand what family truly means. She glanced toward the notebooks and records spread across the table. Eventually, the answer became obvious. Victoria shifted in her seat. Mom, nobody is questioning that Grace has helped. Eleanor looked at her kindly. No, Victoria. But many people questioned whether she belonged. The room fell silent again. The honesty was impossible to ignore. I remembered dozens of small moments over the years. The folding table at holidays. Comments disguised as jokes. Introductions that emphasized where I came from instead of where I was. None of those memories felt small anymore. Eleanor continued. A family is not built by genetics alone. Her voice remained calm. It is built by loyalty, presence, sacrifice, consistency. Several relatives lowered their eyes. Victoria stared at the document in Eleanor's hand. I spent 30 years watching Grace choose this family every single day, Eleanor said. My throat tightened. Nobody had ever described my life that way before. I never thought of it as choosing. To me, it was simply love. That matters, Eleanor continued. More than many people realize. Then she carefully placed the document on the table. The room became so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking from the hallway. My attorney prepared final copies several months ago, Eleanor said. Everything has been signed. Everything is legally complete. Victoria looked confused. Mark appeared concerned. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. I felt completely lost. Mom, Victoria asked cautiously, why are you telling us this tonight? Eleanor smiled softly, a smile filled with certainty. Because everyone deserves to understand the reason before they learn the outcome. The words seemed to hang in the air. Nobody knew exactly what she meant yet, but everyone understood one thing. The answer was coming, and when it arrived, nothing in that room would feel the same again. For several long seconds after Eleanor spoke, nobody moved. The room felt suspended in time. Every person seemed to be waiting for the same thing. The answer, the outcome, the reason she had gathered everyone together on her birthday and spent hours talking about loyalty, sacrifice, and family. I sat quietly in my chair wishing I could disappear. The attention made me uncomfortable. Whatever Eleanor was preparing to reveal, I did not want it to be about me. Yet deep down, I already knew it was. Eleanor carefully lifted the final document from the stack and placed it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. This is the final version of my estate plan, she said calmly. Victoria immediately straightened. Mark leaned forward. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. The room had become completely silent. I am sharing this now because I do not want confusion later, Eleanor continued. More importantly, I do not want anyone misunderstanding why I made these decisions. She looked around the room. Her expression was not angry. It was peaceful, certain, the expression of someone who had spent years thinking carefully before arriving at a conclusion. Everything I own represents a lifetime of work, she said. This house, my savings, my investments, the property outside town. None of those things appeared overnight. Nobody interrupted. For years, people assumed they knew what would happen after I am gone. Victoria's face remained composed, but I noticed her hands tightening together. The truth is that I changed my plans after asking myself a simple question. Eleanor paused. Who has demonstrated what family means? The words echoed through the room. Then she opened the document. My heart began racing. I had no idea why. Eleanor glanced at the first page before looking up. My estate will be transferred primarily to one person. A visible tension spread through the room. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. That person is Grace. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood what she said. The room seemed to blur around me. Several relatives stared in disbelief. Mark's mouth opened slightly. Victoria looked completely frozen. No, I whispered before I could stop myself. Eleanor smiled gently. Yes. My heart pounded. Eleanor, you cannot be serious. I have never been more serious. The room remained silent except for the ticking clock in the hallway. Victoria finally found her voice. Mom, what exactly does primarily mean? Eleanor's expression never changed. It means the house, the investment accounts, the property, the majority of my estate. A collective shock moved through the room. Nobody had expected this, least of all me. I felt as though everyone was staring at me, and I wanted nothing more than to leave. I do not want this conversation, I said quietly. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand on mine. I know. Her voice softened. That is one of the reasons I made this decision. Tears filled my eyes immediately. Not because of the inheritance. Because she understood me. She always had. This was never about rewarding someone. Eleanor continued. It was about recognizing someone. Nobody responded. No one seemed capable of responding. For 30 years, I watched Grace give without expecting anything in return, Eleanor said. She never stayed because she hoped to receive something. She stayed because she cared. Victoria looked away. Mark lowered his eyes. Several relatives sat motionless. Every assumption that had existed for decades was collapsing in front of them. The greatest mistake a family can make, Eleanor continued, is believing that belonging is determined by blood alone. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I barely noticed them. Love creates family, Eleanor said. Commitment creates family. Showing up when nobody is watching creates family. The room remained completely silent. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged her. Because every document on the table had already proven her point. And as I looked around at the stunned faces surrounding me, I realized that the person everyone had spent years overlooking had just become impossible to ignore. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute. The room remained frozen in the aftermath of Eleanor's decision. The documents still rested. On the coffee table, the birthday decorations still hung from the walls. Yet everything felt different now. The assumptions that had existed for decades had disappeared in a matter of seconds. I sat quietly trying to process what had just happened. My eyes were still wet with tears. Not because of the inheritance itself. Because Eleanor had seen me. Truly seen me. For 30 years, I had often felt invisible in this family. Not to Eleanor, but to many others. And now she had made it impossible for anyone to ignore the truth. Victoria finally broke the silence. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. Mom, why did you never tell us you felt this way? Eleanor looked at her with kindness. There was no anger in her expression. No desire to embarrass anyone. Because I was waiting for all of you to see it for yourselves, she replied. And when that did not happen, I realized I needed to say it aloud. Nobody argued. Nobody protested. Even Victoria seemed to understand. Eleanor slowly gathered the papers and placed them back inside the folder. Then she looked around the room one final time. I hope none of you leave here thinking this decision was about money, she said. Because it was never about money. The room remained silent. Money can be earned. Property can be sold. Investments rise and fall. Those things matter far less than people imagine. She paused. Character is what matters. Loyalty is what matters. Love is what matters. I lowered my eyes. Every word seemed directed at something much larger than an estate plan. Eleanor was talking about the meaning of family itself. For years, she continued, I watched Grace choose this family even when she had every reason to walk away. The words struck me deeply because there had been difficult moments. Moments when being treated as an outsider hurt. Moments when leaving would have been easier. Yet I never left. Not because I was hoping for approval. Because Eleanor had given me something precious when I was 5 years old. A home. When Grace arrived here as a little girl, Eleanor said softly, many people saw a foster child. Tears filled my eyes again. I saw a daughter. The room fell completely silent. Victoria looked down. Mark stared at the floor. Several relatives wiped their eyes. No one seemed prepared for the simplicity of that statement. Eleanor smiled at me. And nothing has changed since. At that moment, 30 years of uncertainty seemed to disappear. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to finally breathe a little easier. Victoria slowly stood from her chair. For a second, I did not know what she was going to do. Then she walked toward me. Her expression looked different than I had ever seen before. Less certain. More honest. "Grace," she said quietly, "I think I spent a long time seeing you through the wrong lens." I did not know how to respond, so I simply nodded. It was enough. Some apologies arrive as speeches. Others arrive as understanding. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and smiled. The tension that had followed her all evening seemed gone now, replaced by peace. Outside the windows, the last light of sunset had disappeared. The house felt warm and calm, like a chapter reaching its natural ending. As people slowly began talking again, I looked around the room and realized something important. The inheritance was not the true gift Eleanor had given me. The true gift was recognition. She had told the truth when it mattered most. She had reminded everyone that family is not determined by where a person begins. It is determined by who stays. Years earlier, I arrived at the Harper home carrying a small suitcase and uncertainty. That night, surrounded by the people whose lives had become intertwined with mine, I finally understood something Eleanor had known from the very beginning. I had never been an outsider. I had been family all along.